תודה רבה דוקטור גרי על ההצגה הזאת המאוד נדיבה, ותודה רבה פרופסור מצר על המבנה שבו השמת את הדברים. אני אבקש את סליחתכם, ולב ההרצאה אתן באנגלית, כי אחרת זה יישמע כאילו שאני שקדים בפה וזה יהיה קשה. אז את השאלות ותשובות נעשה בעברית, את השיחה עם הסטודנטים אחר כך נעשה בעברית. ברשותכם אני אעבור לאנגלית לצורך השיחה. הלוז של מה שאני רוצה לומר לקבוצה של אנשים שמעניינת אותם טכנולוגיות למידה וחינוך, זה שסוג ההוראה, סוג הסביבה הכלכלית-חברתית שלתוכה אנחנו נכנסים, מאופיינת ברמת שינוי, למידה, אי-ודאות וחדשנות גבוהים הרבה יותר ממה שאפיין את 2/3 או 3/4 המאה של המאה ה-20. ומערכת החינוך דורשת התמקדות באנשים שהם לומדים, באנשים שמבנה המוטיבציות שלהם הוא שיתופי, פתוח, חקרני. והאירוניה שבאירוניות היא שבסך הכל מה שצריך לעשות זה לחזור 100 שנה אחורה, לקרוא את מונטסורי, לקרוא את דיואי, ולהשים אותם בתוך חברה שלא אומרת דבר אחד, אבל דורשת פועלים שעושים את מה שאומרים להם, והם מהימנים ואומרים כן להיררכיה, אלא במקום זה מערכת כלכלית שדורשת בדיוק את סוג בן האדם שיוצא מהחינוך הפתוח, האדם החקרני, האדם שהמוטיבציה באה מבפנים, החקר מבפנים, והמערכות הלמידה שאנחנו צריכים לבנות, צריכות גם לבנות על האמת הזאת לגבי האנושיות שלנו, וגם להבנות את סוג האנושיות הזה, שהוא אנושיות פתוחה, אנושיות שיתופית, אנושיות שיוצאת מנקודת הנחה שהאחר הוא בן שיח ולא יריב. ושהאני הוא קודם כל אני מבפנים, שמחפש מה לעשות נכון, מה לעשות יחד, ולא אני אנוכי שמחפש את האנגל, איך אני מצליח כאן ודופק שם. Hobbyists have always existed. When in the 1970s or 80s, there were hobbyists who built electric cars. They did fascinating things, but they never threatened General Motors because the cost of building an assembly line was too great for them to be truly competitive. Britannica also had a superb business model. 32 volumes, leather-bound, Nobel laureate and respectable professors telling you what knowledge is, and door-to-door salesmen who tell you that if you are a home that respects knowledge, you should have one of these on your wall. In 1999, two of the world's greatest information economists, one of them today is the chief economist of Google, tried to explain what was special about network economics. And in their second chapter, they said, look at what's going to happen to Britannica, Encarta. It is embedded in Windows. It is part of all of the network efficiencies of being distributed with things. It can be updated. It has massive economic forces behind it. You've got times, and they tried to provide that as a source. And indeed, by the late 90s, Britannica could be found on CD for $500. By the late 2000s, it could be down to $29.95 on buycheapsoftware.com. But of course, we all know that it was not Encarta that killed it. What killed it was a model that was impossible according to economic theory of the late 90s. My first paper on Wikipedia came when Wikipedia was about 6 to 8 months old. I can tell you from memory, if you were to stand up in a room of economists in 2001 when Jimmy Wales put 900 stubs on a platform that anyone could write for and anyone could edit, but no one was paid to do so, and no one exclusively owned the materials, anyone in the room would have predicted that within 5 years, Nature magazine would send scientists copies of Wikipedia and Britannica entries, and the scientists would say these are roughly similarly bad, would have been laughed out of the room. And yet it moves. And Encarta, in the meantime, closed its doors. Not only Wikipedia, of course, the most material success is in open source software. So again, in 1995, two groups of engineers say, there's this thing called the web. We need a web server. Who's going to build it? Well, in the right corner, there is Microsoft, the biggest software company in the world that understands the web server as its core strategic next platform. On the other side is a bunch of academics and volunteers who are developing a piece of software that no one owns exclusively and everyone shares and anyone can develop. Who's going to win? Asked The Economist in 1996. Are you kidding me? Answers The Economist of 1996. And yet here we are, almost 20 years later, starting from August 1995, through boom and bust, two booms, two busts. The blue is Apache Web Server. The red is Microsoft in terms of actual adoption. But you say, look, it took 20 years, but eventually the market model will succeed. Not really. You see over here what happened is MySpace grew and adopted Windows. That's why you have the first bump where Windows grows up. And over here, it's a particular company of spammers that actually uses these. If you look at the top 1 million sites, or if you look at the most active sites, the answer is a simple one. It's been Apache all along. It's now losing some market share to Nginx, which is another open source platform. This is not hypotheticals. This is not nice, let's feel good, it's all work. This is just plain adoption for mission-critical software throughout the world. It's a fact. Over the last, whatever it is, 93, so 22 years that I've been working on the internet, the idea of commons-based production, of production based on resources that no one owns exclusively and everyone shares, moved from being a pipe dream, a silly idea, to being the core organizing model for large chunks of the information economy. Why did this happen? Why did this happen? A variety of reasons, but the first thing to recognize is that innovation, from an economics perspective, is a really quirky good. And as long as we were in the economy of coal and steel, you could treat innovation as a side quirky thing and focus on the things that really matter. Wheat, coal, things that have normal economics. But innovation is different. Public goods are everywhere at the core, and normal economic goods are at the periphery. Spillovers are everywhere, particularly positive externalities, things that I produce something that I see it's useful to you. Most important for what I want to talk about later today is that the process and diffusion are knowledge dependent. And I'll talk about this in a few minutes through an old story. But most importantly, knowledge is tacit and sticky. What is tacit knowledge? It's what I know but I can't tell. Try to write down a memo about how to ride a bicycle. Anybody think that you can hand the memo over to someone else and they'll know how to ride? That's tacit knowledge. Knowledge that you know, but you can't codify it for communication. That means it's sticky. It doesn't just, you can't just send letters around it, you have to move people around it, and it has to go through transfers. This is critical to the relative advantage of open information production and commons over others. And motivation is more diverse and complex, and we'll talk about that a little later. The critical point is that knowledge resides in people, not all of whom can work on your project or in your company, and that loose organizational boundaries allow people and knowledge to flow across firms. That's what open source software, that's what open development does. It is a way for people to find projects, find each other, and find resources to teach each other, learn, and innovate together with each other from across different organizations, as opposed to being stuck within organizational boundaries where the resources are here, the collaborator is over there, and the other collaborator is over here, and they lose the capacity to cooperate. And we'll talk a little bit later about the institutional, the innovation of open source licensing and the norms and culture supporting open communication. The critical point is that new connections rather than new nodes are what's critical, both within and outside firms. And these can be commercial or non-commercial, and they have to be driven by diverse motivations. And that intrinsic motivation and cooperative and social engagement are critical to this. Why? Because you can't codify knowledge, which means you can't monitor it, which means you can't perfectly contract for it. If you can't perfectly contract for how creative will I be at 9 a.m., or do I know this over here in a project that's not really my project, you can't contract for it, you can't monitor for it, you can't price every single combination. Therefore, when you look across our domains, and I'll come back to this with a graph at the very end of the talk, when you cut across lots of domains, knowledge sectors, like universities, like healthcare research, like, for that matter, religious organizations, are non-profit. They're not driven through the market. They're socially embedded. There's a real constraint on how far the market can actually manage knowledge. And that's why you see these systems that are mixed motivational. So in order for us not to be totally focused on the internet, let me tell you a much, much older story, older by internet standards, about that just explains the role of knowledge and flow of people. One of the surprising things in the early 90s was that all of these 1970s computer companies from the first computer revolution in Silicon Valley and in Route 128 in Boston, they all existed in the 70s. But in the 80s, when the personal computer went along, Silicon Valley went on to develop all of these names at the bottom that you see that you know. Route 128 did not. And one of the core questions that several researchers looked at is, what's the difference between these two areas? They've got pretty decent universities out in Boston. I think they do, at least. They've got a pretty decent starting position. Why not? The first set of answers was Annalise Saxenian, who was a geographer, who basically said, look, in Silicon Valley, it actually turns out they all live quite close together. Their kids go to the same schools. They shop at the same supermarkets. They talk to each other. They flow, and they create new firms. People flow. Alan Hyde, a sociologist, came along and said, it's not just that. It's not just the geography, because in Route 128, the suburbs are all over the place. They take an hour and they don't get together. Alan Hyde said, no. The culture of Silicon Valley firms is that they're proud of their startups. HP had lots of people who came up as employees, then had a good idea and came out. And HP, instead of suing them to say, stop, you can't compete with me, we're proud of them and we're recruiting engineers by saying, we incubate startups. Whereas in Route 128, they would stop them, they wouldn't let them, they would control them. Ron Gilson came later on and said, yeah, chokhmah. But in California, because of weird 19th century reasons, they are not allowed to sue them for non-competes. They're not enforceable. They're stuck with an open flow of people. So they develop a culture that says, instead of I'm constrained by not being, oh, I love you, you're creative, we're wonderful, we foster you. But the point of all of these together is the same point. What allowed in these stories Silicon Valley to develop as it was, whether it's because the foundation is a legal disability to constrain them, whether it's a set of social norms that embraces them, whether it's the geography or whether all of these work together and reinforce each other, people flowed, knowledge flowed with people, and for reasons either legal or sociological, boundaries between firms were permeable, so that knowledge didn't end at the boundary of the firm, instead it flowed. What the internet did was take this particular regional, cultural, legal moment in history and bake it into the infrastructure of knowledge production and exchange. It became ubiquitous. Whatever the law did, people were then able to work around it. Such that if you understand, in some sense, production in general as being either market-based or non-market-based, and centralized or decentralized, the story of the first 2/3 of the 20th century is one of centralization, both in the market and outside of the market. From markets of small producers, you see the emergence of larger companies, conglomerates, ultimately to these bizarre behemoths like ITT, who didn't know who they owned and why they owned it, but nonetheless had it under one CEO. And you saw the move, the social democratic move from social networks and family networks for social provisioning to the state, and the centralization and the rise of the welfare state bureaucracies. But you basically get, whether you're looking at through Schumpeter's eyes, through Weber's eyes, whether you're looking at specifically in management science with Taylorism and Fordism, you see a centralization. By the 80s and 90s, the limitations of centralization, the unwieldy nature both of firms and excessive government bureaucracies becomes so constraining that you see both intellectually and practically in both domains of market and non-market a yearning for some other model. And the only model seriously considered at the time at the broad level was back to the market. So you see, for example, internal markets within firms. You see the breakup of the conglomerate. You see sale off of units. But you also see privatization of government functions, beginning with privatization of assets, moving on later on to private prisons, private hospitals, private whatever it is. Because the thought is you basically have the state or the market, the large centralized firm is not working, the large centralized government is not working, let's set up the market. What we've seen as a result of the success, or at least partially as a result, of the success of open source software, Wikipedia, and the much broader range of practices, is that social sharing and exchange has come to be seen as a solution space alongside markets, states, firms, and traditional nonprofits. It doesn't displace them all, but it has become a new solution space for all sorts of solutions for various kinds of companies. So obviously at the core we have, as we said, free software, we have Wikipedia, we have something like Ushahidi, for example, which is a platform that was developed in Kenya for people to be able to report on violence during elections, but then got turned around and translated into earthquake relief in Haiti and snow plowing equipment in Washington, D.C., and ultimately was developed by some Egyptian developers into an election monitoring system that was then used in Egypt in its short-lived period, in Tunisia, and beyond, all happening within this domain of the social. But we've also seen small firms. We've seen a firm like Yelp challenge various restaurant guides by essentially combining consumer reviews, TripAdvisor with regard to trips. We've seen IBM was the first company of a large scale to actually incorporate free and open source software as a core strategic move, investing $1 billion in free software development, donating 500 patents to the Free Software Foundation. The Linux kernel sits at the heart of the Android system. We see firms not doing everything open source, but treating it as part of the solution space. And we've seen governments and governmental bodies doing the same thing, whether it's Boston Citizen Connect to try to be a more responsive city using connection with citizens, or whether it's the UN High Commissioner on Refugees that has cut down the period in which it analyzes satellite photos from 3 months to less than 2 weeks by harnessing a volunteer task force for around the world to actually look for post-drought refugees on satellite images and get the work out to them. The point is not, here are 3 examples. The point is collaboration based not on market signals or on hierarchy has moved from being way out there, off the wall, can't happen, it's against physics, to, hey, that's really curious, there must be a little corner where it can work, to, how do we do this? Well, it's a solution space. Might work, might not work, but it's no less or more of a plausible space to look for a solution than let's figure out how to, I don't know, how do we assure proper price signals for people making love, which was where the late 90s Richard Posner was trying to respond to the AIDS epidemic. So, what happened? For the first time since the industrial economy, the most important inputs into the core economic activities of the most advanced economies became radically distributed in the population. That means computation, communications, sensing, capture, but it also means the human, creativity, innovativeness, but also experience, insight, intuition, all of those things that are so hard to codify, as well as the organizational capacities that we're all taught before kindergarten, during kindergarten, and beyond that allow us to work together. Activities that have always been central to the human experience, but were driven to the periphery of the economy during the Industrial Revolution, moved from being peripheral to being central, and areas, large areas of economic production at the cutting edge of economic production were succeeding in getting around what Karl Polanyi called the disembedment of production. We got to more socially embedded production in these domains, not everywhere, but in these domains. These included primarily, and critically here, commons-based production. Production based on inputs that no one asserts exclusive rights to, manages outputs such that no one exerts exclusive rights to them. It can be individual or collective, it can be commercial or non-commercial. The critical point about the commons is that authority to act lies where capacity to act resides. If the economics of computation meant that everyone was holding a computer in their pocket, the commons said, if you have it, you may use it. That's why the debates over intellectual property were so central, because it was an effort to assure that even though the capacity to act was widely distributed, the authority was still centralized in Hollywood and the recording industry. That's why the debate over commons in IP was so important. That's why the debate over net neutrality is so important, because again, the capacity to act computationally is in your pocket. The question is, do you have the authority to act, and does the telecommunications carrier have the authority to block that capacity? The second phenomenon that emerged, that's a subset of commons-based production, is peer production. That is to say, large-scale aggregations of people effectively producing information goods without reference to price signals or hierarchical commands. And at the same time, we saw sharing of material resources, SETI at home. Now we are seeing it a lot in the on-demand economy. Again, with the social transactional network being the primary network rather than the market. And we'll get back towards the end to what's happening now with Uber and Airbnb that's actually pushing a completely different moral economy using the same transaction cost economics and creating a major battle that we're in the middle of. It's important to understand, as we try to locate this technological moment that social production presses back on two central driving hypotheses of industrial capitalism: the centrality of hierarchy and the ubiquity of self-interest as the most reliable lever to push on when you try to get people to do things. Both of those things are pushed back. So hierarchy has been a central character of industrial economy at a minimum since the beginning of the 20th century. If you think of Frederick Taylor's Principles of Scientific Management, you see the original idea that the best way to organize a factory is for the engineer to measure precisely what action each employee needs to do, impose it in a codified form. You need to do this and that for this and this amount of minutes per hours per day, and then to impose reward and punishment for deviation from that. Oliver Williamson, who later got the Nobel Prize in Economics, basically defined the entire raison d'etre of the firm as being the most efficient locus for controlling opportunism on the side of workers. That is, says it's not just an efficient mode of production. This is what the firm is for. At every level, the employee will try to do what's good for them. The manager will define what they need to do and control. And when you get to the very top, what do you do? You get Jensen and Murphy in the 80s, culminating in 1990, saying the CEO has to get stock options to have the same incentives as the shareholders, otherwise you have an agency problem. This is probably the single most influential paper on the question of economic inequality, because it's so cool when you have a theoretical reason to line your own pockets with many millions. Do we see hierarchy re-emerging in social production? So the idealized 10 years ago was, we have no hierarchy. But how many people here have edited Wikipedia? Edited, not read. Written something, okay? We have people. I knew in this audience I could count on some of you. How many people have supported or written anything for free on open source software? Cool. So all of you know that, well, those of you who raised your hands, know that an absence of hierarchy, an absence of people you need to negotiate with, is not exactly the way it works. But the question is it simply the reintroduction of hierarchy or not? And I put to you that at least the best sociological research that I know of is that it's not. It's in fact a much more complex, multi-layered system of negotiation than something that replicates the core idea of industrial hierarchy, which is, I, the manager, tell you, the worker, you should be doing this with that person over there, using that particular project in this particular time frame. And if you do, I'll give you your salary, and if you do it in 3 days less, I'll give you a bonus, and if you don't, I'll fire you. That's the core difference. What you see instead is a legal framework that is non-proprietary, commons-based, such that the license removes property as the core anchor for saying, if you don't do this, I'll remove it from your ability to act. No, you can fork. That's exactly the first right that lets you resist hierarchy. The other thing is there's a norm of rough consensus, and rough consensus is a really, really interesting norm. It's not the same as majority rule. Majority rule can shut down the 49%. Who's for, who's against? I don't need to persuade you. I've got the votes. Neither is consensus conducive to debate. I don't need to listen to you. I've got a veto power. But rough consensus means I have to engage you in conversation. I have to get to something like consensus. But frankly, if you're going to be a stick in the mud, I'm going to leave you behind. That's not hierarchy. That's conversation. And it's backed by norms. So assume good faith, one of the central Wikipedia norms, is something people can throw at each other when they don't agree. Shared normative frameworks. One of the fascinating ideas when we arrive at a certain moment in pluralism, we try to persuade ourselves that all views are equally valid. And one of the fascinating things about these practice-based communities, where something needs to come out, is that there's a shared sense of good or purpose or reason. Does the code run? Does it run well? Is this more or less neutral? Let's argue about it. These are communities of practice that have to output something that they are, in their shared understanding, is connected. It's a commitment to reason-giving, an argument, even if the argument is not always the most civil. A commitment to meritocracy, nested, redundant layers of competition. So this admin blocked you in Wikipedia. It doesn't mean somebody else mightn't unblock you. This particular set of arguments went up to the ARBCom. That's very important. But still, there's this wonderful ignore all rules at the bottom. There are formal institutions, but they're never 100% constraining. There's an enormous culture of irreverence and resistance. Everything is mocking. Everything is poking. Nothing accepts. I mean, this is one of the things, בעברית באמת קל לי להגיד, לדבר על כמה אנשים לא מוכנים לקבל חד משמעית מה שאומרים להם מלמעלה. But this is central to these practices. And my favorite in this regard is the Wikipedia ignore all rules rule. If a rule gets in the way of making Wikipedia better, ignore it. Central to the practice across many of these domains. And leadership is limited by the fact that you have multiple pathways. So it's not that there isn't power in these systems, but there's no hierarchy. And it can work. The second thing that there's tremendous attack on, or pressure on, is the idea of universal self-interest and the efficiency of the margin and marginal pricing as the way of organizing production. One of the most remarkable statements right after the collapse in 2007 was Alan Greenspan saying this: I made a mistake in presuming that self-interest of organizations, specifically banks and others, were such as that they were the best capable of protecting their own shareholders. I found a flaw in the model that I perceived as the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak. I had been going for 40 years or more with considerable evidence that it is working exceptionally well. This is sort of the standard bearer of contemporary capitalism saying, well, I've been going on for 40 years and model doesn't work. But it's not just the collapse. What we essentially have seen is across multiple disciplines, at the same time that networked practice is challenging self-interest, universal self-interest as a good model, we've seen changes across multiple disciplines from a period between the early 60s through the mid-80s, where all of the models moved to self-interest, whether it's evolutionary biology that went from group selection to selfish gene, whether it's in economics with strong assumptions of self-interest with guile and mechanism design, whether it's in political theory, the logic of collective action, the tragedy of the commons, whether it's in management science from Taylorism through Williamson. What we've seen in each of these and many other domains is that since the late early 80s, early 90s, there has been a wave going back. In evolutionary biology, back to indirect reciprocity, multi-level selection, gene culture coevolution. In economics, the experimental turn has produced enormous, overwhelming evidence of much of the population acting in ways that are based in reciprocity, trusting and trustworthy, to some extent status-seeking, to a small extent altruistic. Doesn't mean that we don't have a stable part of the population that reliably behaves according to their self-interest, but they're one of several models. We've seen Lynn Ostrom's work on the commons, sweeping away much of the work before it, at least for people outside. And since Toyota Production System and network production, we've seen it in management science as well. So there's been an intellectual shift across multiple domains that has then also fit the practice of many people to say that the model we've been going on, to follow Alan Greenspan, the model we've been going on for 40 years is flawed. it doesn't mean we're all going back to the kibbutz. Trust me, I tried one in שיזפון, we tried to build one. לא תמיד עבד. שני החברים הכי חשובים בכל קיבוץ זה מישהו וצריך. But it is the case that we have more complex motivational models than self-interest would suggest. And at a bare minimum, we need to understand that alongside material interests, we also have moral commitments. We also have affective and psychological responses. We also have sociological drives, some of them instrumental and some of them identity-based. And all of these work as forces to end up pushing and pulling us in different directions. And in many senses, the critical point is that they aren't always aligned. The non-separability of motivational vectors is a critical insight for anyone designing a system for people, as many of you are and are interested in, because when you add money or reward or punishment, you might align the material interests with what you care to do, but you might turn something into socially meh. You might turn it into morally unattractive. You might make it stop giving you a warm glow of doing something for society. It doesn't always align. You have to think of all the vectors together. So now, toward conclusion, how am I doing on time, actually? Nah, here it says 9. You're not going to get away with that one. If you imagine, סליחה ורד, לא התכוונתי להציק. If you imagine that we try to identify a three-dimensional space, where on one axis we have the question of who's available, who knows what, from routine, anyone can do this, to you really know this today and nobody else does, but we don't know who, and projects of what should we do today? Predictable, we do this every day, we get up in the morning, versus, I don't know, it's uncertain, who knows, let's figure it out and experiment. And then the third dimension of capital, something that is highly capitalized and something that either requires no capital or for which the capital is highly distributed in the population, like computers are now. If you look at these dimensions and then you imagine that there's a space that is well understood, a space that is risky, that is to say, we don't know what will happen, but we know the probabilities, and a space of uncertainty. We don't know the probabilities, let alone we don't know what will happen. What you see across these is that well-defined economic incentives and marginal thinking are very good when we have universally self-interested people doing things that we more or less understand and can price in advance and tell them what to do. The further out we move, the less well marginal thinking works, and the more we need to move to other things. In particular, I'd say we should think of three kinds of trade-offs. I already mentioned the motivations question. The more I know who and what, the easier it is for me to price the action. The more uncertain it is who's the right person with the knowledge and what exactly about their knowledge and creativity I'm trying to get, the harder it is for me to define it, the harder to monitor, and the more I need to rely on diverse motivations that say, I want to do this. This is really cool. Similarly, from the organizational perspective, the more I know what I need and the higher the cost, the more important appropriability is. I know what I'm going to produce. I need to be able to sell it to make money or to somehow get the money for it. The more I don't know, the more important it is to have freedom to operate. The ability to just sort of explore a space of possibilities and come across something, even if appropriability isn't so clear. And finally, the more I know exactly what I want, the more I'm focused on optimization. The more I don't, I go towards innovation and ultimately exploration and experimentation. And what happens in these spaces is that we can map many of our innovation practices in this three-dimensional space. So if you try to understand, start with things we understand. Try to understand managerial hierarchies. They're really good when they know what they want, when people are more or less standardized, when it's easy to monitor, and you can reward and punish people for not doing. Then they're really good at being efficient at this. They optimize, they appropriate, they're fine. The more you look at things like academic science, if you look at the Mertonian science up there, the whole point is to build an organization that won't work like this, and that doesn't have appropriability. That's why we have public funding. And that doesn't have direct response to the dean that says you did or didn't succeed with this paper, out. I know, it's in the ideal. It doesn't quite work that way in the real world. But that's the ideal of Mertonian science, precisely in order to be able to allow this kind of exploration and experimentation. And when you look at the ways in which universities interact with entrepreneurial firms, interact with large firms, you see exactly the role of entrepreneurial firms and VCs as translation points between uncertain exploration and well-understood production in this area of risk. And that also helps you understand why they're so valuable to put next to academic centers. Because you actually have this membrane of transfer of knowledge from free exploration with practically free failure through to cheap failure in the small firms, all the way to very expensive failure when you've got thousands of employees and they're all out of work. And you've got this free flow between these different areas. That's why you have these things. Now, one of the things that we're seeing is firms try to get it both ways. So, for example, open innovation, which usually refers to a situation where a small group of firms exchange their engineers with each other and exchange their maybe marketing and customer services. They're still trying to keep it appropriable enough to be inside, but circulating enough to get some of these benefits of open knowledge flows, knowledge embedded in people. And you see these various strategies playing. One of the things that we're seeing now, I hate it when people use crowdsourcing as though it's the same as peer production. So think Amazon Mechanical Turk. You break down all the conception of the job is done at the center, then it's broken down into little pieces and people just execute it. This is way down here where people are all entirely fungible and they're just sort of managed within a framework very clearly. Completely different from a situation where people are just exploring whatever it is that they want. One of the beautiful things is it also allows you to map Eric von Hippel's work on user innovation, because essentially when the farmer who first invents a crop circle that allows you to have better irrigation, the companies don't even know that that's something that's valuable. It's only the farmer in the place who says, ooh, this would be really cool, I have an idea, and then shares it freely with other farmers. And then the company comes along and productizes it because it's out there. And that's why you always have the commons as such a space of exploration. What we're seeing today with the internet, with distributed innovation, with the rapid rate of change, is competition between two opposing paradigms. You have a paradigm of complexity, uncertainty, and change competing with an idea of predictable, calculable risk and well-behaved change. For this one, you need rights. You need to be able to manage it. For this one, you need openness. You need exploration. You see an idea, a focus on where we get growth from diversity, experimentation, innovation, as opposed to control, efficiency, and stability. You talk about design as adaptive learning or late binding as opposed to planned, optimized, and tightly coupled. And therefore you talk about commons, cooperation, intrinsic motivation, and socially embedded work as opposed to proprietary managed hierarchy with extrinsic incentives and in many cases alienated labor. These are two fundamentally opposed models of production. And you could have a normative argument about why you want to be here or here. But I think as a practical matter, what's happening with the rate of change and the rate at which technology is reshifting constantly and global competition is reshifting constantly who can do what, we don't have the option of imagining that we're here. We're here. This is the world we live in. And as long as we understand that this is part of that world, we need to understand that we need to build how these systems work. But from a moral perspective, it also tells us that we need to build systems of socially embedded work, where working not only allows you to make a living, but also is part of what you understand to be socially engaging with others. And that's how you need to design the work. Not because it's just right, but because you need people to be able to be engaged. Which leads us, for 2 minutes, to Uber, Sidecar, and Lyft, and all of these others. The on-demand economy. I hate it when people call it the sharing economy. What's important to understand is it has the same transactions cost economics that drove cooperative and peer production, because it's all about, I know where there's excess capacity for labor or for materials, I can communicate with it, and there's a transactional network. But the transactional framework is purely price-based, not social, and we're seeing it if you look at couch surfing. What are the requirements? Share something, respect differences, participate, be neat. It's all about social exchange. If you look at Airbnb, it's basically a small hotel industry. Those are not the same, and in fact, they're competing models. So it's critical for us to understand the difference so we resist the mistake that just because it's more efficient, it is also a model for the next generation. It is not a model for the next generation. It is a fundamental alternative to a sharing economy. And we're seeing it now across the services economy. One of the most amazing things that's developed in the last 18 months is that what looked like 1 or 2 services is now essentially threatening or promising, depending on how it's designed, to capture the entire service industry or large chunks of it at the local level. And this could lead to a more socially embedded model, depending on how it's run, or an even more alienated model of production with even more risk shifted onto employees than was true before. So let me conclude with this. As you're building your systems, it's critical to think of them, whether they're learning or not, as cooperative human systems, as systems that conceptually move from rationality modeled as universal self-interest to concerns with diverse motivations and the interactions between these diversions. As a design system, it's important to understand the literature on cooperative human dynamics and build systems based on evidence not derived from models of self-interested rationality, but from experimental and observational work of diverse motivation and interaction. And politically, it means we can't separate out incentives from fairness, because these are central. If you look at the core building blocks, they're communication, they're empathy and solidarity, they're an understanding of what's right, fair, and normal within these relations. They also include calculation, but you constantly have to worry about the calculation versus the social and moral, and they have to be embedded with social dynamics of trust, transparency, reputation. These are central design characteristics. The practice is first and foremost a social practice. The learning is a social practice. The production is a social practice. It's networked. It crosses organizational boundary. It's collaborative. It's productive. It's meritocratic. It has to be autonomy respecting. And maybe, and I take this as a risk, maybe it needs to be virtuous. It needs to be the adoption through habit of well-intentioned action that becomes a normal learned habit, not just something you always need to fight with yourself about. So to me, as I sit here and talk to a group of people who are thinking about learning technologies, I translate this in 2 core ways. The first is, who is the kind of person you need to educate? It's the kind of person who can live in this environment, who has the resilience and the robustness to take this uncertainty, who has the internal drive and the internal interest to try to experiment with it, and can drive themselves in collaboration with others and who understands themselves in continuous conversation with others and negotiation. But the second is also as platform designers. Ignore people who try to tell you you need to design something based on crisp incentives. That's not who we are in general. We are diversely motivated people. We respond to diverse motivations. You have to be very careful. Think of this framework of cooperative human design as a framework for designing the system, as well as a way of thinking about what the sort of person is we need to create. Thank you.